Hello again. In this video, I'm going to be going over money lending in the medieval period, looking at Jewish and other communities, and looking at what extent Jews were involved in this compared to other groups, and maybe some of the reasons why, some of the context, and just generally how the topic has been viewed historically. There's obviously a bunch of ways that money lending and just, giving out loans in general has been done throughout history, and like different definitions of usury and different ways of calculating it, stuff like that. I'm not going to go into like any of that just for the sake of brevity, because this video should be quite long. I have a decent amount of sources, so yeah, let's just get into it. So as far back as ancient Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq, there has been evidence of charging interest on loans. Basically any society that had, any kind of urban life and written system of records more or less had this idea, and of course Jews were no exception, and it's discussed in the Bible, as everyone knows. It's a pretty old concept, but just focusing on the Jewish community for now, if we go back to the time period between Jesus and Muhammad, we can actually see that the majority of Jews not only did not live in Europe, but also were still at this time mainly agricultural workers, and primarily based in modern-day Iraq and Persia after the destruction of the Second Temple and the dispersal from modern-day Israel-Palestine. And generally, we don't start to see the urbanization trend with Jews until the rise of the Muslim caliphates. And there was kind of a push-pull to this type of urbanization because the caliphates needed a administrative class of people and just generally educated, literate people in their growing empires, I should say. And the Jews, being literate, through Talmudic study and stuff like that, fit this role quite well. Not to say that at this time they were money lending, they were just involved in administrative roles and other trades and crafts. But in order to do all those things, you had to be able to keep records, write down stuff, just, generally run businesses, which would be difficult for more illiterate type people. At the same time in Europe, there wasn't too many Jewish communities, except a small amount in Italy who survived from the Roman expulsion and just continued living there, but most other communities in Europe just either never really were settled or didn't survive up until the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, when you start to see Jewish immigration into other parts of Europe, either from Italy, not necessarily the ancient Italian Jewish communities, but rather from the Byzantine Empire, and they would go from there to Italy to other places in Europe, or via Spain when the Moors arrived in Spain, essentially Jews from North Africa. So over time, that's when you start to see Jewish communities forming in Germany and in England eventually with the Norman conquest. But yeah, the process takes some time, a couple centuries, to get fully established. And so that's kind of the background information for what's happening. And I'm getting this info from the book The Chosen Few, which argues against some of the usual explanations for why Jews were involved in money lending. For example, it dismisses the idea that Jews were banned from guilds, which then forced Jews, in a sense, to become moneylenders. Jews, according to the book at least, were definitely banned from guilds, but that didn't happen until later on, and Jews were already established as moneylenders at that time. They also don't really accept the idea that it was just general persecution that forced Jews to take up a job that more or less, you had liquid assets so you could escape persecution and still have essentially your money with you and weren't tied down to land or anything like that. Because while obviously the book acknowledges that Jews were persecuted and stuff like that, a lot of these persecutions didn't take place before the Jews started becoming moneylenders. The Jews would immigrate to a place and they were already established in moneylending, as well as in other fields, of course, but they would just dismiss that argument as well. And interestingly enough, they also dismissed the argument that they were forced into it because no one else would moneylend, because at the same time they don't believe, and the historical record clearly shows, that other groups were involved in moneylending as well. The whole idea that Christians thought it was a sin, so they just didn't do usury, quote unquote, is definitely not accurate. And while the book says that in the year 1000, Jews weren't really involved, by the year 1100, they got more involved, and by the year 1200, it was their main occupation, which I can quibble with later on with some other sources, but the book still says that they never had a monopoly on moneylending in any area. So they would essentially argue that it was because of the educational system, specifically the kind of Talmudic schools that Jews would be a part of, and learning how to read and write and form social bonds and cohesion and just had general community across different areas. They had their own legal codes and institutions, and essentially it just meshed very well into these communities being engaged in like trading and money lending and just professions that required record keeping, strict rules, stuff like that. I'm not doing such a great job of explaining it, but I'll post the picture here. It basically just kind of reminds me of the default hypothesis of Nathan Coffness that I always bring up. In a sense, it's kind of just like a twisting of that. Not saying that they're like, they have high IQs or anything, but that they were just like one of the communities that did have a lot of education and learning and social ties that allowed them to do these types of things. And so while I will push back a bit in the future about how they describe Jews as being involved in money lending as their dominant profession, the authors of the book more or less would say that among Jews, it was a high proportion of them who were involved in this, but among the general European population, they were just like one of many groups involved. This could be seen in a case study they look at in Italy, where they look at some data which shows that Jews were involved in money lending in certain cities and towns and what have you. And then you can compare that with Byzantium, where they basically just said that Jews were not involved in money lending at all. So obviously there's like an in-between of just not involved in it and being pretty disproportionately involved in it, but still like nowhere near being like the majority money lending community or anything like that. Kind of paralleling this history, we can also read the Reverend James Parks' works. He was an Anglican priest who wrote a lot about like Jewish-Christian dialogue and history in the mid-20th century. So a bit older source, but definitely valuable nonetheless. And he points out that it was not really a banned practice under Roman law, and a lot of European societies still clung on to parts of Roman law even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and that the church, although a lot of early church fathers denounced the practice, could never really fully get rid of charging interest. It's just kind of like a natural thing that happens in any kind of market economy, like over, some subsistence, like hunter-gatherer society. So he discusses that, and like the other book talked about how Jews were one of four main groups who were kind of involved in this practice, like basically whoever had coins, because at the time the coin supply was rather low. If you had coins, you could then go on to loan money. And that because Jews were some of the primary merchants in the beginning of the 10th, 11th century, that they had access to coins. And due to the expanding kind of trade route system and just general travel with pilgrimages and stuff, crusades going on, there was just kind of a need for money lending in general to either finance pilgrimages or just straight up finance crusades themselves or what have you. Just that whole time period just saw a growth of the market and just growth of trade and travel in general. And that along with this growth in trade and the Crusades, there were more of an emphasis from church councils on the issue of usury itself, which had been touched on by some church fathers and stuff, but really wasn't the focus in the earlier Middle Ages. But once the Holy Roman Empire became a thing with Charlemagne, and just Europe was becoming more and more Christianized and just generally more organized after the chaos of the fall of the Roman Empire, church councils, along with the Crusades, started to take note of usury and condemned it. And the kind of interesting factor in a lot of these condemnations in these councils was that they imposed Christian penalties, like preventing someone from being buried in a Christian cemetery or being denied communion, stuff like that, for engaging in usury. So obviously these condemnations were against Christian usurers and not Jewish ones, because obviously these wouldn't apply to someone Jewish. And oftentimes people would try to just evade certain canonical injunctions against practicing usury, such as just lending through a Jewish lender. So that was a thing that was done apparently. Or just loaning money for no interest, but if the interest wasn't paid back in time, then there'd be a very large fee or something to that effect. Essentially, there was just kind of workarounds to get around condemnations of usury. And however usury may have been defined, there was just a different way to do it. And essentially Parks's argument, along with a lot of other economists and historians, just argued that it was just kind of impossible to avoid loaning without any type of interest. It's just kind of impossible and just way too restrictive on economic activity, and gives a couple reasons here for why that is. And in more contrast to the chosen few, he does take seriously the argument that Jews were just persecuted and needed to have kind of liquid assets. And also he says that feudal lords kind of encouraged this behavior to use Jews as sort of a cash cow. There's going to be some authors I'm quoting later who kind of debate against that as well, but just kind of setting the scene that he has more of the traditional view that Jews were kind of forced into it through these types of coercions, more or less, as well as being banned from guilds and stuff, which does have some contemporary evidence, so I don't totally necessarily dismiss that argument wholesale. I think it really just depended on the time and place, and it's not very black and white. But at least two primary sources kind of talk about this issue of Jews basically having no other recourse but to moneylend, and you can find that in the early 1500s by Johannes per Golt, and also in the earlier medieval ages from Peter Abelard, who also uses this argumentation. So not exactly like this kind of excuse, if you want to call it that, arose from thin air or anything. He also makes the pretty counterintuitive claim, I would say, at least based on most people's perceptions of this issue, that Jews were actually more preferred than other Christian moneylenders like the Lombards and Cahorsins and others. He argues that while Jews were expelled, and obviously other groups were expelled as well, that I covered this in my previous video, but I'll go over some more evidence in this one as well. But anyways, after Jews were expelled, they were almost like always inevitably taken back in, because usually they just needed some kind of moneylenders to be around in a society, and often were preferred. And there were various writers who discussed this. Bernard of Clairvaux talked about how the Christian usurers were worse than the Jewish usurers. Different like poets and authors, and even folk songs were written about how bad the Christian usurers were as opposed to the Jewish ones who replaced them when they got kicked out. So it was kind of weird and hard to believe at first, but I mean, those are the sources, and feel free to check them out, and I'll list all the sources in the description. But that's that, and I would recommend looking into the book Shylock Reconsidered by Joseph Schatzmiller, which goes into a specific case of a French Jewish moneylender who was actually taken to court and apparently had a lot of like Gentile defenders of him in this court trial, like defending him against accusations of exploitation and stuff like that. There's just like a lot of info that I had to cut out from this video for the sake of time, but yeah, I would recommend going into all the sources more in depth. But generally kind of summarizing Parks's view is that four main groups were the lenders of the time, including monasteries, secular clergy, merchants, and tax collectors, and Jews were mainly in the merchant category along with other groups. And by the time of the First Crusades, the Jews were already no longer the kind of like big game in town when it came to merchant trading. Just other groups arose because of like all the travel and necessary trading that comes along with military conquest and stuff that took place. So the whole pool of merchant activity grew generally. So other groups just got more involved, and Jews like no longer had this kind of like monopoly on early trading that they had before the Crusades. And that these groups like almost kind of counted on each other to be expelled from certain areas, and they would just like kind of quickly go in and take the place of whoever was expelled. Like Jews did this to the Cahorsins, the Cahorsins did this to the Lombards, etc. This can be seen in England, for example, after the expulsion of the Jews, which I'll talk about later, with some of these groups even having similar charters to the Jews, which were basically just like written agreements that allowed certain communities to establish themselves in an area and function. Even the Knights Templar, which at one point was like one of the biggest essentially money-lending banking institutions in medieval Europe because of its associations with pilgrims and pilgrimages and like dealing with the financial aspect of that as well as the financial aspect of crusading. They were also like expelled and abolished and had councils denounce them and stuff like that. So essentially there were just like a lot of different groups engaging in this kind of activity, and there was just like a general response to all of them. The main difference being that Jews obviously just didn't share the same religion as the other ones, so they just were seen in a slightly different light. And as a result of this, sometimes had certain privileges that other groups didn't have, and sometimes those groups had privileges that the Jews didn't have. Certain large financial centers Jews just like weren't allowed in and just didn't have a presence in. And generally, although one might think that this kind of occupation was a sort of privileged occupation and, probably compared to a lot of feudal peasants was still not like some ideal situation. They were kind of at the mercy of the mob and just were at the whims of the ruler, and if the ruler didn't want to protect them any longer, basically shit out of luck. And really it was from the 12th to 14th centuries that this kind of Jewish moneylending thing was going on, and by the end of the 14th century had dissipated a lot just due to other groups rising and just being generally kind of targeted. So I think his work is really readable and accessible, and you can find it on archive.org. But gonna move on once again to a more modern historian who addresses the issue quite directly in her book, The Myth of the Medieval Jewish Moneylender. She starts off citing people like Roscher, Sombart, and Weber as kind of starting the modern historiography behind the economic function of the Jew in the Middle Ages, if that's the right way to put that. But essentially these early modern historians, and I guess more like sociologists, portrayed the Jew as kind of like having a special function, and while they did disagree with each other, they kind of viewed Jews as playing a special role in European history in terms of like capitalism, the rise of capitalism, stuff like that. And while she uses them as kind of the progenitors of this idea of the special economic function of Jews in modern historiography, she argues that the whole like kind of meme, if you will, idea of the Jewish moneylender was present at the time, like in the medieval ages, but was more a result of none of the actual like economic and historical facts on the ground, but rather kind of a certain angst that came along with crusading and creating a religious fervor that identified usury as like a big moral issue, and kind of like a newer, more virulent anti-Judaism that came about with, once again, crusading, because it focused on the other, either externally like Muslims or pagans in Europe, or internally like the Jewish internal enemy, if you will, as well as the growth of secular monarchies. So those are kind of main 2 points in terms of like the history of the subject, or at least how it was viewed historically. That's why I'm using the term historiography. And while she discusses the differences between the 3 authors and how Sombart and Weber took a more like sociological, religious viewpoint on how the Jews changed Europe, whereas Roscher had like a Volkish model of history where the Jews were just like a more intelligent race or something, and kind of influenced Europe that way. Weber and Sombart had a different view, whereas Sombart thought that basically the religious injunctions of Christians forbade them from doing usury, and so the Jews fulfilled that role, and Weber kind of had a similar thing, but over time Protestants like adopted, the capitalist ethic and were basically like spiritual Jews in a sense. I'm probably totally getting this wrong and not generalizing it very well, but for the sake of time, the more important thing is that they're just all kind of taking for granted a specific function of the Jews in this time period, and also just view the time period as having like a specific break of a pre-capitalist, pre-market type economy to what we would call like a proto-capitalist economy, where in reality that kind of gets pushed back against by other authors later on, or other historians, either just straight up criticizing their knowledge of the historical facts. Apparently people like Weber didn't understand that Christian moneylenders were a pretty common thing as well, so there wasn't this kind of dual morality going on, or a critique of the Middle Ages being specifically like non-capitalist or pre-capitalist, totally unlike the modern capitalist system, which is not so black and white, that there were like precursors to what we would call capitalism even in the Middle Ages before this kind of system was introduced by Jews, supposedly. Regardless, just on various grounds, like these original 3 writers on this topic were just kind of rejected over time, at least in academia. And she kind of summarizes the critique of this position overall here. However, the author goes on to say that although there's all these critiques of Roscher, Sombart, and Weber, there's still kind of this clinging on to Jews like having at least like a specialized role as moneylenders, not necessarily arguing that they like led Europe into capitalism or like had any like outsized role, but just that they were indeed disproportionately involved in money lending, which we could see in like The Chosen Few, for example. But here is where the author goes on to discredit this notion and starts to look at specific examples, kind of debunking or at least putting into context this notion of the medieval Jewish moneylender. Her first main example are the Jews of England, and she starts off giving a quote by Lionel Abrams, who was an English historian of the Jews of medieval England, in which he more or less states that all the pomp and importance given to Jews during this period are more or less false. First, she gives some data points suggesting that it was only like a certain top echelon of Jews who even really paid the majority of taxes coming from the Jewish community, and essentially compares this to other urban dwellers in medieval England who were Gentile, and basically comes up with the same breakdown and shows some graphs corroborating this. She's mainly getting this information from old tallage records, which I guess are just like a form of taxation in medieval England. I couldn't really understand what like a tallage was, but essentially it's like an old form of taxation. So essentially across both communities, it was only like a top echelon, top minority of people who paid most of the taxes, almost kind of like we have today, and that everyone else was involved in other professions that just had lower tax revenue. And a lot of the info is kind of biased because generally people have more records of wealthier people and like their writings, their tax records, etc., as opposed to the records and, you know, what have you of the poor masses of people, and basically concludes saying that it was like a minority profession amongst Jews. And even of moneylenders, it was only a minority of those who like were rich enough where it was kind of like their full-time occupation and they actually made like a good enough living to pay a lot of taxes from it, because there were just kind of certain moneylenders who only did it a little bit here and there and more or less were not professionals. And basically just keeps giving information and tables regarding this, so you can just look at all the graphs and stuff and tables. I mean, frankly, a lot of this information is like really dense and kind of hard to sift through, so if you really want to, you can read all this stuff, but I mean, I'm just giving you like kind of the highlights for sure. And states that around half of the Jewish population was too poor to pay taxes at all, similarly with the Christian community, and that all things considered, Jews played a pretty minor role in tax revenue for the kingdom. Ergo, the Jews were not this kind of cash cow, at least at this time period in England, so it's kind of pushing against what James Parks had in mind. And kind of concludes her information just saying that the Jews were not fulfilling any kind of like special economic function, and really the only kind of thing that made them unique was the fact that they were Jews, so kind of had to be administered to in a different way, but all in all weren't like this galvanizing force of proto-capitalism or anything like that. And from this suggests that the expulsion of the Jews from England in 1290 was actually more just for like religious reasons and not necessarily because they were users of the society or anything like that, which is something the historian Robert Mundrill also talks about in his work on the Jews of England, discussing various factors as to why the Jews may have been expelled, and that it's not so black and white that it's just this, oh, they were the usurers and they got kicked out for that, but there was like political and religious reasons not related to usury or moneylending. There was kind of like a heightened papal pressure to confront Jews from a religious angle and various things going on the continent at the time that influenced King Edward. And it was all just kind of part of like a broader cultural religious movement that did have some anti-usury elements in it, which didn't just include Jews, but also like Italians in England and other groups. So if anything, like usury was just kind of like a sub-sector of what was really the heart of the issue. Moving on to volume 2 of The Myth of the Medieval Jewish Moneylender, Mell discusses more broadly the issue, and as something that I've noted before with the Reverend James Parks, that Christians were the first ones to be called out for usury, and that a bunch of church councils were called to condemn this, specifically Christian usurers, and she provides like graphs and tables of different councils that discuss this, and points out that most scholars kind of hand wave away a lot of other things that are known to be just kind of medieval rumors and superstitions, like the Jewish blood libel thing or Jewish ritual host desecration, which obviously some people listening to this might believe in those things, but I'm just saying what like the general scholarship is, that those things are just kind of thought of as medieval like superstition and obvious just anti-Semitic beliefs, but that historians still kind of take for granted the actual historicity of the Jewish moneylender as a kind of historical phenomenon while rejecting these other things. But in Mell's case, she's kind of associating them together and saying that there's not much grounding to go with any of them, or at least just like they've been exaggerated and like infused with a lot of religious bias, which kind of correlates back to my like meme talking point, which if you get anything from this video, I would just say that the whole moneylending idea of the Jew is just this kind of cultural historical meme that just has a lot of power to spread, but is one of those things where if a Jew does it, it's Jewish usury, and if a Christian does it, it's Jewish usury, where the whole idea of usury is just called Jewish, whether or not a Jew is engaging in it, or whether or not Jews, started, created this type of thing, which they didn't. I've talked about Bernard of Clairvaux. He just discusses the quote-unquote Christian usurer. I saw this a lot with E. Michael Jones' book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, where he'll just call people who, read the Old Testament and go against the Catholic Church Judaizers, or, more Jewish than Jews themselves. So it's just kind of a phenomenon that happens where even if someone isn't ethnically or religiously Jewish, it's like, oh, well, that's Jewish behavior, so they may as well be a Jew. Anyway. And lastly on this point, she just notes that although councils may talk about certain issues, that doesn't necessarily mean that there is always a historical or factual basis behind them. There was a lot of church councils that, if we do go by this logic, then you'd have to admit that Jewish moneylending wasn't really the main thing these councils were even attacking when it came to Jews, and a lot of them attacked other things like breastfeeding, for example, like Christian babies being breastfed by Jews, because sometimes people would give their babies off to be breastfed by other people, and this was apparently a very condemned practice that the church didn't like. But you don't really hear the myth of the medieval Jewish breastfeeder or anything like that. So it really just depends on what you want to take from certain historical documents and sources and what you ignore. Another thing she points out is just the religious interpretations that Jews and Christians had over usury, mainly over the passage in Deuteronomy, where essentially the religious difference in interpretation kind of undergirded the rift between the two communities, and it wasn't so much that the Jews were dominating usury and the Christians didn't engage in it at all or something like that. It's more to do with this theological dispute kind of highlighted the rift, and it wasn't so much the economic facts on the ground, but just the theology and way of thinking about the issue itself caused the issue to be more distinguished, if that makes sense. But at the end of the day, both groups condemned usury, but just had different ways of allowing it to be done, or to what extent it could be done, or things of that nature. And she also points to the Crusades as just reinforcing religious tensions and kind of creating a moralizing effort on the part of Christians. Talked about this before, but it just created more of an intense us and them mentality in general. So Jews were obviously the outsider in Christian society, and even goes over some expulsion decrees where she shows that usury was just kind of a subset of things that the expulsion decree was pointing out, but the kind of overall emphasis of the decree was basically a religious one, and even included a diatribe against the Jews cohabitating with many Christian maidens. So just like there was this stereotype of the Jewish usurer, I guess there's a stereotype of the sensuous Jew who was, banging a bunch of Christian women. Look, this is my anecdotal bias here, but I don't think that was a thing. I don't think Jews were just fucking Christian chicks all the time, and that led them to be expelled either. So I just think that's kind of funny. Maybe a study should be done on that. But that's her concluding remarks on that issue. And we could see, again, going back to Robert Mundrell's book, he talks about how there was a general anti-usury campaign in England, but it was directed at various groups, not only Jews. However, Jews were seen as being unable to shift away from moneylending into more, moral trades, just being merchants, which was not looked down upon at that time. However, Mundrell points out that the records do show pretty much that Jews did shift away from moneylending into the normal trades, just as well as any Christian urbanite types, and were not engaging in moneylending when these anti-usury laws were passed. And by the time the Jews were actually expelled, moneylending and usury itself really couldn't have been the actual reason, at least the contemporary reason for the actual expulsion, and does this kind of blame it on the Crusades and just the general goings-ons in the continent. Which all of this leads Mell to say that basically all these expulsionary decrees and whatnot are just an attempt to solve the Jewish problem, which obviously does not get solved, as history clearly shows, and that the rise of secular monarchies who went above and beyond the papal states. And she actually talks about how the papal states were one of the few areas that did not expel Jews, but regardless, there can just be seen a historical shift in how Jews were perceived over time, and it doesn't really reflect the actual facts on the ground, more or less, is her argument. So anyway, if I'm being redundant and bringing up similar points, this is because the authors came to the same conclusions. I can't keep track of all. I read a lot of people. But anyway, Mell continues to talk about the Jewish community in Marseille, France, where she kind of goes over the same compare and contrast that she did with the English Jewish community. She discusses how the Jews of Marseille used the common day system, which was like a Latin-based investment contract used in the commercial revolution and trade in Europe at this time, opposed to their own contracts, which were a thing in the Jewish community and Hebrew and stuff like that. So the fact that Jews were using a Latin-based contract system kind of shows that they were more participants in the changing economy and not like the drivers of it. And furthermore, were just not really represented at all as moneylenders in medieval Marseille. Obviously, it's just one city, but it was like a pretty important trading area. And yeah, basically did not show up as lenders, and if anything, were more borrowers, but were just involved in merchant trade, as well as other jobs such as like doctors, etc. So basically her point is that they were just like any other urban citizen. So I would say even less involved in money lending than the Jews were in medieval England. Again, these are both just specific times and places. Like people could probably look at Italy and see more of this going on, but it just goes to show that it just differed across space and time. So that's just another example. And after that, she just discusses how the Crusades and like the changing economic situation in Europe just caused some uneasiness with the overall change, and this required a scapegoat. So Jews just naturally kind of fit into that role. And although the view of like a totally subsistence gift economy changing into a money economy is kind of exaggerated historically, there was a rise in thinking about like this kind of issue of money and the value of money and the moral value of money, which both Jews and Christians expressed, which can be seen in these like short moral tales that were written about money in general and monetary issues. And from the Jewish side, they were called Sefer Hasidim, and from the Christian side, Exemplas. But anyway, short stories were written from both communities, just kind of discussing the pitfalls of money and lending and just like greed, stuff like that we would see today. And based on like more modern scholarship on this time period, that essentially the medieval economy wasn't so black and white, and it was as one scholar puts it, an instituted process which was not led by any group individually, but was just kind of like an organic change over time, but not really from like one specific mode of economy to another. And that both groups, Christians and Jews, were undergoing this process together, and no one was like causing it or anything. It's just like kind of the natural change in society, which again would go against like people like Weber and Sombart and their analysis of the rise of capitalism and stuff like that. And she just makes her conclusionary remarks on pages 182 through 184, which I'll put down here just in case you want to like pause and read, because maybe I didn't do justice in explaining it. Again, like a very dense book, covers a lot of historiography, stuff like that. So just trying to give a broad overview here of like what I thought was most important and most accessible for most people, but I do encourage people to check out the book. And last but not least, we have the book Promise and Peril of Credit, which I think is a good supplement to these other texts. This book only focuses on what are called bills of exchange, which I'll just have the author describe real quickly.
They were materially small, thin pieces of paper, smaller than a modern day check, but about the same size, a little less than a modern personal check. And they originated as the need to transfer currency in a different location and in order to finance the long distance trade of commodities.
But essentially, she makes the argument that these financial instruments were thought to be invented by Jews, but in reality were not, and goes over kind of like the inception of this idea by a French writer named Clairac, where this myth can be originated from, or the idea of it, and how even though there were opposing views to his and people who looked at his work and talked about how he wasn't using proper evidence and that other communities could have been blamed. For example, a lot of German historians kind of saw Italians as more in charge of this kind of thing, but later attributing it just kind of like how Mell puts it, just like the general course of history and no like one group behind it. But anyway, regardless, Clairac's view was kind of institutionalized by Montesquieu. So this idea, this like meme, if you will, of the Jews creating bills of exchange just kind of was permeated throughout European historiography. And she even brings up people like Sombart and Weber and Marx even, who use this idea to bolster their viewpoints that we've discussed earlier. Marx had a similar view of Jews and capitalism as the others. But during the interwar period, a lot of Italian scholars essentially did away with this whole notion of Jews bringing about early capitalism, and the whole idea of bills of exchange being created by Jews being discredited much earlier. But essentially, I'm just using her book because I think it's a pretty good microcosm of kind of like this Jewish meme, the Jewish question, the JQ. I think it just is like a good example of that happening with a certain specific economic function, a specific economic tool that has some like random guy writing a book that just happens to talk about, oh, Jews invented this thing, and that just became like the widespread held belief of a lot of people for centuries, even though there was like no backing to it. But because of this whole discourse on Jews generally as being like moneylenders and users, it just kind of like fit like, oh, they also invented this tool, this economic tool, and like blah blah blah. It just kind of meshed well with a lot of the ideas of the time anyway. And I think the author kind of reflects this idea of like the Jewish meme as being kind of like a broad-based answer to a lot of like the anxieties and just like changes going on in history. On page 298, she talks about how this like so-called Jewish invention became a way of addressing these type of questions. And I think you see that reflected in a lot of JQ discourse, where Jews are just kind of like said to be at the front of all this stuff and like the sole reason or like the big reason why a lot of like cultural historical changes happen, even though like obviously a lot of changes that happen historically aren't due to like just a small group of people or just like handful of individuals. It's usually like way more complex than that, and usually people just lie, like Clariac evidently did. And I just think that reflects a lot on like modern JQ discourse as well. And even in this book, just as a funny anecdote, apparently at a time in France, a lot of Huguenots, like French Calvinists, were known to be some of the top bankers in France, but they were thought to be Jewish because a lot of them had Old Testament names, which was like a practice that I guess like Protestant French people took on. Like they took on Old Hebrew, Old Biblical names, much like people would today. And just a little bit more on how some of these older historians and older arguments kind of mirror the same stuff we see today. A reviewer of Sombart's work, The Jews in Economic Life, which kind of like makes the whole argument about Jews and capitalism and takes the bills of exchange invention for granted, remarks how Sombart basically uses this like logical fallacy that because Italy had quite advanced banking and also had a pretty sizable Jewish community, ergo Jews like invented banking. I'm not saying that's like a direct quote from Sombart or anything, but apparently this reviewer basically broke down what Sombart was saying into that it's basically just a lot of conjecture. And another historian, Henry Gregory, went out of his way to kind of just pin the blame on the invention of bills of exchange on Jews, even though there was other evidence pointing to other people and to the contrary, and clearly just had this kind of like one-track mind of like, oh, it must be the Jews because the Jews are usurious and blah blah blah, stuff like that. Which I don't know, I think if you like hang around JQ circles enough, you kind of see this bias showing from a lot of people. But anyway, it just kind of goes to show that this whole kind of like easy memeing of history, if you want to call it that, has just been around for a long time. And it's just like very easy to point out, especially the Jews for whatever reason, as being behind a lot of stuff and just being like the cause of certain things, where it's just kind of like an easy believism type of thing where they're just the answer to all of life's questions. So yeah, I think looking at moneylending, it's just another example of like JQ stuff where you can look at the actual history of it and see that A, disproportionality doesn't equal like domination, which I've kind of shown in a lot of videos, and then B, if it was even disproportionate at all, in some cases it wasn't. But also, even if you look at the history and kind of like debunk, quote unquote, the historical view of like what happened, it's just an interesting look at how this type of like argumentation occurs and like how the historiography of this issue plays out. It just kind of correlates with a lot of modern JQ discourse and older JQ discourse, so just thought I would make a video on it, just like all the other topics I do, that basically there's this underlying theme of not only like the veracity of the actual claim itself, but like how the claim is used to explain a lot of things, and more or less is kind of used for essentially lazy answers to more complex questions. But anyway, that's the video, and feel free to like and subscribe, share this if you'd like. I know it's kind of a long one and kind of dense, but I'll try to put all the sources I used, and yeah, thanks for watching. Have a good one.